My name's Rob Holmes. I'm a private investigator. I've stopped millions of dollars of counterfeit watches entering the US market. This is how crime works. It's estimated that 23.3 million counterfeit watches are circulating in the US right now. There have been plenty of stories of the counterfeit watch industry being tied to child labor, sweatshops, and even human trafficking. You're going to have organized criminals who are doing this kind of stuff. When I work undercover as a distributor, I have to be very credible. Doing what I do doesn't come without a little bit of fear. Many of the fakes nowadays come with the box and the authentication certificates. You used to see watches that would just have maybe one of the trademarks, like just the crown on the face, but not the crown on the dial. Now manufacturing has gotten so good that even the cheaper knockoffs have everything. There are people who buy $1,000 counterfeit watches, Patek, Rolex, Louis Vuitton, all the big brand names. And they buy these watches for $1,000 because they are near clones. And in that world, the current term is epic. You can't tell it from the original. And especially with some of the brands, especially Rolex, the only way you can tell is by opening up the watch and looking at the movement. Because the Rolex movement, there's no mistaking a Rolex movement from a counterfeit. I don't care how good the Chinese factories are. A Swiss movement made by Rolex is always going to be known once you open the back. If it is sold in America, there's a factory in China that makes an exact copy of it. It's just a matter of how high the quality is. Manufacturing in the counterfeiting world replicates the manufacturing in the real world. Wherever manufacturing is cheap, that's where manufacturing is going to happen. These factories can afford the same machines that the real companies use, and they use the same software. Often that software is stolen through industrial espionage. On these Chinese marketplaces, they have a tier for a manufacturer or a seller, a tier level where you can obtain an inspection by the marketplace. They'll have a third-party inspector come in and take photos and check your location for child labor, all the regular things that people would look for, and you can pay for a clean bill of health. But there's no telling what these factories are really doing. We know that some Chinese factories use forced labor. It used to be the 80s, 90s, even into the early 2000s. The watches would come here by container, and then the logos would be put on in factories here in the United States, in sweatshops right in the major cities here in the US. That's kind of stopped because the Chinese factories have become so good that the American factories couldn't keep up with the quality. We find that most of the product comes out of major ports, and Guangzhou, inside Guangdong. China became so good at logistics, it was much easier for people to sell as affiliates here in the United States and have them shipped from the Chinese factories or the middlemen. This is how good these Chinese factories are. QC, which means quality control. They'll send you a high-res photo of your item and the shipping label, so you can check the item, make sure it's the right model, and also make sure that the address is correct on your shipping label. You say yes, go ahead, boom. Within a day or so, you'll get the tracking number. Watches would be shipped in, say, one case of watches, say 1,000 watches or 10,000 watches in a small portion, and the rest of the container would end up being beach balls, cosmetics or anything, cheap stuff. What they do is they ship it to their clearinghouse, a distributor in Pennsylvania. They slap a new label on it and ship it to you from there. So it looks more domestic. And when it looks more domestic, it looks more trusted. But most counterfeit watches reach the United States through the US Postal Service, or DHL. Shipped individually to the seller. You could buy one watch, you could buy 5 watches, you could buy 100 watches. I buy samples from all over the world. One time I had a package sent to me, and it was a toy alarm clock. I opened it up, and there was a watch inside. I haven't received a disguised counterfeit in several years, and I think it's because of how easy it is to get across the border with just a little bubble wrap. The watches you buy on the streets they're usually bought the same way by the seller. If you buy 100 of them, they're $8 a piece. So you get 100 of those, package is only this big. Shipping's gonna cost 80, 90 bucks. And they know the Postal Service is flooded right now and Customs is flooded right now. So it's really kind of a field day for the mailing of counterfeit watches. The US Customs can't inspect every single package. They used to say they inspected one every 1,000, but I don't even know if that's possible anymore with everybody buying $20 dresses and things like that. Counterfeit distributors don't worry about the obstacles because the profit is so high. So if something gets stopped off at customs, they'll just ship you a new one. And that happens very often, even with a container. Those 10,000 watches, they get caught up in customs, that'll just be the cost of business. So those obstacles are pretty simple for them to bypass. In my perception, the demand for fakes, non-deceptive counterfeits, where you know it's fake, is simply because people like getting something over on the man. From the 80s until now, I found that demand has been pretty consistent throughout the years. I mean, no matter what the economy is looking like, people like a bargain and people like to spend less for something that looks nice. Let me explain the gray market a little. There is a market where people think they're getting a deal. You'll see, 20% off retail, things like that. There's a gray market where things fall off the truck and things are diverted outside of the original supply chain. And once they get here in the United States, they can sell legitimate products, and this is including the watch industry. They can sell legitimate products at 10, 20% off the original price, and they're real. But these companies have databases with those serial numbers in them. And you take it to a real repair shop, they stick it through the database because a lot of watches are stolen. So you take it to a real repair shop, oh, sorry, this watch was a gray market product intended for another place. So that's why once you buy something on the gray market, you're kind of always working underground. So that leaves you susceptible to buying the epic fakes, the ones that are $1,000, but you're paying 6 or 7 because you think it's wink, wink, falls off the truck. And a lot of these companies too that deal in the gray market do what's called mixing. And what they'll do is they'll have some genuine gray market and some that are counterfeit, and they'll just mix them all in. Or you look like a sucker, I'll sell you the fake and I'll sell this guy the genuine. It's a very interesting world, the secondhand market, because it is kind of self-regulated. Obviously, they self-regulate because of lawsuits too. If I make a test buy from one of these sites and it turns out to be counterfeit, they can get sued. So yeah, so there's a lot of liability at stake there too. So the legitimate ones don't do that, but again, you'll have the shady ones, especially the ones that you walk up in tourist areas. And they sell genuine secondhand watches, but maybe the one you have, is a fake. I tell people whether you're gonna buy a product or you're gonna have a product repaired, go to an authorized dealer. But yeah, these repair markets are very shady. There was a case in the 90s that my father and stepmother worked called the Fort Worth Gold and Jewelry Exchange. And this guy, his name was Ronnie Cooper, he advertised in all the national magazines. And he would have ads that said, we buy gold, we buy watches, we sell Rolex watches. And he would even do repairs. What he would do when he bought the watches was he would replace the gold with gold plated. And he would constantly be doing that. So you'd be buying a genuine watch, but most of the gold was swapped out. And he did this for many years. And jewelers still do that. They're often called Franken watches in the replica world. He got 5 years, the guy. He got 5 years for mail fraud. That's what they got him on, because all this stuff went through, shipping and the postal service and things like that. The brands don't like the secondary market because they take away from you buying a brand new product. My dad was the guy on Canal Street in the 1980s and 1990s who caught the folks that were selling counterfeit watches. I grew up in the 80s going on raids with my father and making undercover buys. Canal Street was the epicenter for counterfeit watches in the entire United States. They had Midtown. That was where all the folks with the briefcases would show up. Okay, those guys would walk around and, the old, "Psst, hey buddy, want to buy a watch?" That kind of thing. Or they would set up a briefcase with legs and they'd be very mobile. In Chinatown, they would be standalone stores with big metal roll down, roll up doors. On raid days, they would go with a van or a U-Haul truck with off-duty cops and firemen inside the back of the trucks. And they would have spotters along the way who would go to local diners and tell them the addresses where they've spotted those watches that day. Then the people would fly out of the trucks, and if they didn't get there in time, and the guys rolled down and locked the doors, we had industrial strength saws where we could saw through those locks. It wouldn't be uncommon for my father to come home with a U-Haul truck full of bags, hefty bags, full of counterfeit watches. Actually, I was the only 14-year-old at my high school that was walking around with a Rolex watch. Everybody knew it was fake, but during my dad's Canal Street years, he would hire out-of-work actors in New York to disguise themselves and go conduct undercover investigations. Those people dressed up as homeless people, pregnant people, everything you could think of, so that they're going through one day at a time and they don't look like the same person. Doing enforcement on Canal Street, it was no hayride. He had bodyguards, and he also had constant threats. There were people with guns shooting at them. There were very often times where people would come right after my father. I've been investigating counterfeit watches professionally since 1995. So when I started my company, all the luxury brands knew who I was, and they knew I started my own firm. And then I started getting cases from the luxury brands. During my undercover buy process, we have undercover identities set up all over the United States. So, I could buy from the same website 5 times and they would think it's 5 different people. I have every counterintelligence method you can imagine. We do everything we can to make sure that these identities are not traced back to us. The brands usually work directly with law enforcement, if they can, because it's expensive to hire an investigator. My cases are typically cases that might go civil or a case that law enforcement doesn't have the time for. And then once my case is finished, completed, it's put on what I call a silver platter. And then they will pass it on to law enforcement. There's various terminology in the counterfeit world. In the watch industry, a replica is a near perfect, or at least look-alike version with the trademarks of an actual product. But then you have lower level counterfeits. You have, say, $300 to $500 counterfeits, and they're mid-level. And then you have anything under 300, they call them The funny thing is, those cheap watches, they're the ones you buy on the street. The keywords to find these counterfeits evolve because of enforcement mechanisms. You can't just Google counterfeit Rolex or counterfeit Louis Vuitton or even replica. The word replica for the last 10, 12 years has been pretty much blacklisted everywhere along with brand names. So they would come up with different words. They would also use letter swaps. Like for Rolex, they could use ROIEXX. If you're seeing words like replica, clone, dupe, or 1:1, 1-to-1, you're probably looking at a counterfeit. If you're trying to figure out if a watch is a counterfeit, first you need a magnifying glass, and then you want to look at the details on the watch face. If there's any imperfection whatsoever, it's not real. One of the great myths of counterfeit watches is that the genuine has a sweeping hand and the counterfeit has a ticking hand. Well, that was resolved sometime in the mid-90s. So most counterfeits now have a sweeping hand, so don't be fooled into thinking that's a way to tell a counterfeit from a real. So I was just handed a watch for filming purposes, and I can tell this one's genuine because, see, there's a crown logo at the 12 o'clock mark, and the crown logo has an oval at the headpiece part of the crown, and that's etched in perfectly. The quality of the craftsmanship of this watch is impeccable. The brand name is printed there perfectly. Also, with many of these watches, there's a magnifier at the date. It's called the Cyclops. And counterfeiters don't always get that right. And also, the date with the magnifier can just be a little off. It's not perfectly. If the number's 12, the day is 12, it's going to be exactly there. It's not going to be partially there. And a lot of the counterfeits, they just can't get the date exactly right. And the Cyclops, too, the original brands have a very specific non-reflective material they put on that Cyclops that holds it onto the watch. And that's very hard to duplicate as well. So the clarity of the Cyclops is very, very important. Also, you'll see the brand name on the inside of the band. Now, the high-end counterfeits may have those, but you do have to look for these things. Also, the registered trademark on the back, you can look for that and see if they've gone to that great detail. And with this particular watch, because it was made, I'd say probably at least 20 years ago, maybe longer, in order to find the serial number, you would have to actually take off the band here. And you would have underneath the band edge here and here, you'll have a serial number and you'll have a model number. Especially with the Submariner and the diving watches, the bezel is very difficult to make. So the Swiss engineering of the bezel is going to be perfect with a genuine watch. Many of the counterfeits, it's kind of jingly as you're moving it. A lot of this stuff isn't one specific thing. You look at the quality and you say, wait, this isn't real because, this is a little shaky. It should be more solid. It's a little light, should be heavier. The counterfeit watch industry is a financial crime. You deal with all kinds of fraud in this world, especially here in the United States, bank fraud, all this kind of stuff. In the 1940s, there was a law passed called the Lanham Act, and it made counterfeiting trademark goods illegal. And that law stood for a very long time. There were no penalties, though. It was sort of symbolic. And then my father, along with a very small community back then of folks lobbying the U.S. government to strengthen the laws, the Anti-Counterfeiting Act of 1984 was passed. And the Anti-Counterfeit Act of 1984 created penalties for each one of these offenses. Currently, the federal laws are in trafficking. So trafficking is illegal federally. So that's where customs comes in. But most of the sale or display of counterfeit goods is state law. So in New York, New Jersey, California, almost every state has a display for counterfeit as a penalty, and also in their penal codes, the sale of counterfeits. I've seen people face some serious jail time for selling counterfeits. Often they're the most egregious, but on the street level folks, it's the repeaters, just like with drugs. Someone purchasing counterfeit goods online probably isn't going to enter law enforcement's radar or the brand's radar unless they are named or discovered as a supplier to someone else. Often, because purchasing isn't necessarily, it's not illegal to purchase, but obviously trafficking is, and you're bringing things over across the border. I've seen the civil penalties get very steep. When my clients want to sue someone, often we'll look for assets. If a person owns a house and the mortgage is paid off, these people have the ability to pay $70,000, $100,000 in restitution, and a judge will, often comply. So I've seen people's lives get ruined by selling counterfeits. It was in the late 80s when my father came across BTK, the Born to Kill gang, Vietnamese mafia. One day, his brother, who worked with him, saw a wanted poster with a $200,000 price on my father's head. Turns out, the Born to Kill gang, they were charging all of these vendors for protection, but they couldn't protect them against my father. So they figured if they killed my father, they would at least alleviate the problem and they would justify their own extortion racket. And because of that, we had locks on every door, every window. And my father told me one day, I remember, he said, "Rob, I know you don't like listening to me, but If I ever say duck or jump, you better do it because it might mean your life. And I always took that seriously after that. I still do. When my father's Canal Street work started really taking off, I was uninterested in the family business. I was 17, 18, 19 years old, and I was kind of going off doing my own thing. But my brother was like 13, 14 years old, and he was primed to do this work. He was bred for it. So my brother was running out, gathering license plates and, looking in windows, in factory windows and things like that. I actually rebelled against the family business, and I went to Bible college. And I decided to drive to LA to become a stand-up comic. Turns out I wasn't very funny, but in the meantime, I needed a day job. But then I started going on Rage, just like my father, on the opposite coast. And it was amazing. Los Angeles' area, similar to Canal Street in New York, is called Santee Alley. And it was a several block area, just like New York's Chinatown. It is filled with counterfeits. In the 90s, Santee Alley, just like Canal Street, it was the Wild West. Everywhere you went, there were watches everywhere. I mean, people had them up and down their arms. They had them in briefcases. They had them at booths. They had people who rented space out in front of booths and paid thousands of dollars for that. Yeah, and then after years and years of doing that in the 90s, my boss retired in 2001, and I started my own company. So I started my company in 01. I was working a lot of the similar cases with my father and my brother. So then my father passed in 04. Yeah, after my father died, I thought it was important to continue the family legacy. His company folded because he had nobody in New York to follow in his footsteps. And then after he passed, my business was taking off. And I needed to duplicate myself. And I figured, what better way to duplicate myself than to partner with my brother? Ever since then, I mean, there's not a day that goes by that we don't think about Dad. I mean, it's hard for me not to look at my brother and see something, one of my dad's traits. We grew up watching him work. He was our hero, and we emulate him. We both do. So yeah, I mean, it's nice. I mean, sometimes I feel like he's in the room.